Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And this is another episode looking at the effect of the Russia invasion of Ukraine on energy markets. And I'm proud to welcome my friend, my longtime friend, Anas Alhajji. He is the editor of Attaqa, which is the only Arabic language energy media outlet. Anas, welcome. Dr. Alhajji.
Good to talk to you. Thank you.
Yes, welcome to the podcast. Now, Anas, I gave your title. We've known each other for a long time now, but if you don't mind, just briefly introduce yourself, assuming no one who's listening here knows who you are. If you don't mind, give us 30 or 40 seconds.
Well, all they got to do, just go to Anas Alhajji, ANASALHAJJI.com, and my short bio is there. They can just check it out.
Okay, great. So let me ask the very basic and very broad question. What is happening in oil and natural gas markets now today? What is going on? And it's been very volatile lately. What's the latest?
Well, yesterday we had oil prices going below $100, and there were multiple factors that contributed to that. One of them is related to China, 3 related to Russia, 2 related to the United States. The one related to China basically is the latest part of it is the lockdown of a major city in China. But even before that, demand in China was going down after the Olympics. Definitely when we look at prices, China does not like high oil prices. We know since May 2021, they were trying to use their strategic petroleum reserves to lower oil prices. So I am not surprised if part of the decision to do the lockdown is to lower prices. And I'm not talking about conspiracy theory here, because we've seen it with coal, we've seen it with LNG, when they literally cut off electricity to major cities, some of the largest in Asia. So why this one is different? It's not. I think it's the same.
So just so everyone who's listening knows, we're talking, today is Wednesday, March 16th. So now we're, about 20 some odd days, 24 days since the invasion, since Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th. You recently did a webinar it was titled Oil, Iran, Russia, and OPEC, What's Next? So what's next?
This is going to be tomorrow at 7 p.m. Is going to be on Twitter Spaces.
Oh, okay. So I thought it had already. So that's on Thursday evening, 7 p.m. Eastern.
Tomorrow, correct.
Okay.
7 p.m. Central Time.
Okay, got it. Thank you. So
time.
Tomorrow is March 17th. Yeah. Okay.
Correct. The last one we did was on why doesn't OPEC or why does OPEC price its oil in dollars, and why they haven't changed that, especially in light of the news yesterday of Saudi Arabia basically considering the use of the UN as a payment. That was published in the Wall Street Journal.
Right.
We know now this is not correct. I know it got a lot of coverage, but I am not surprised if they used it and they used the Wall Street Journal to test the water.
I see. So, but I guess the question, and I want to come back to Iran, because I know you have, if I'm not mistaken, you still have family in Saudi Arabia, and how the Saudis view any rapprochement between the U.S. and Iran. But let me ask the broader question here, Anas. What's the long-term impact of this isolation of Russia? And I guess, what is the long-term impact, and can the world live without Russia's Russian hydrocarbons?
No, not at all. As a general statement, there is no replacement for Russian oil if we lose all of it. There is no replacement for Russian gas if we lose all of it. All we can do is replace some of it, but not all of it. And at the same time, the idea that we are going to lose all of it, even under the worst scenarios or under the most severe sanctions, is not correct. And the reason why, because Russia produces oil in the eastern part of Russia, which is connected to China via pipeline. So they will continue at least exporting that. We already know from the history of Iran, from the history of Venezuela, that they continue to export despite all the sanctions. So the idea that we are going to lose all the Russian oil is not even feasible.
May I interrupt there just for a second, because you mentioned the eastern part of the country. This is also where the Russians are exporting gas now to China as well through the Power of Siberia pipeline. So this is the other big, I think, potentially tectonic issue with the U.S. and Russia and China is that Russia and China have become very close trading partners over the last few years, with Power of Siberia pipeline, which is a 5,000-mile pipeline, 400 billion 30-year long gas supply contract. I mean, this is a enormous commitment between the two countries for hydrocarbons. So you're saying that is certainly the Russia-China trade is not going to be impeded by any of this. But is that the major part, or is it? I know I interrupted here, but is that the most significant part of Russia's exports, or what about the rest of the world?
It's not the most significant, but the idea here is that those scenarios where we talk about no Russian oil at all or no Russian gas at all, they should not be even considered. Because Russia can export to the east on one side, and they can smuggle, just like what Iran did and what Venezuela did. So this scenario, I mean, we don't need to waste time on it. But the issue is, and that's what I think we should consider here is this. I think we should consider the other side, where the war ends and we end up with Russia coming back, but a weaker Russia, but no control at all of Western oil companies inside Russia, which means that the West just lost its whatever it has inside Russia in terms of influence. And the issue becomes,
so to be specific, there you're talking about Exxon and their investment at Sakhalin, and then Shell, and I mean, who were the other big Western investors?
Okay, let me tell you this, because I think the audience should know this.
Okay.
This is kind of really important.
Sure.
And tells where we are going. We have Shell, we have PP, we have Exxon, we have Eni, and we have Total, and we have Equinor. And all of them basically announced that they are angry at the Russians. They want to help the Ukrainians. Every company announced some way to help the Ukrainians, etc. But if you look at the details of what they did, it's really embarrassing. I mean, for those who are pro-Ukraine, they should be ashamed of what those oil companies announced. First of all, for Shell, if you look at their announcement, and I'm reading their transcript, so this is not like some news from some news outlet. All they got to do is just go to their websites and read what they issued. Shell said they are not going to buy Russian oil, but if you read the statement, in the spot market, because they have the contracts and they can continue buying the contracts. So in the spot market, they announced it from here, and then the second day, the head of Shell. Sorry, we were talking about Shell here.
Right.
The head of Shell basically apologized because Shell bought a whole ship full of oil in the spot market because it was $22. It's cheaper than Brent.
Oh, I'm looking at their statement here. Immediately stop buying Russian crude on the spot market and will not renew term contracts.
Okay.
We're changing our supply chain to remove Russian volumes.
And the word gradually could mean a month, could mean 10 years. And then in the second paragraph, they start talking about energy security and how they are going to balance the Russian supplies with energy security, which means that we need the Russian oil for a while to enhance energy security.
Right.
Then you go to other companies, and that's where it gets really fascinating. The three companies, the three European companies, the French, the Italian, and the Norwegian, I mean, people think they stopped their operations in Russia. What they announced was they stopped their future investment.
Right. Okay.
In Russia.
Right.
Future investment is not going to affect operations. It's not going to affect Putin.
Gotcha.
And those three companies, what's common among them is all of them are partially owned by their own governments.
Right.
So they are standing for their own government. Their governments are worried about energy security.
Well, let me follow up on that, because it seems to me that that's really, well, I'll ask the question this way, because as I've thought about this, and I've done several lectures since February 24th. Is this invasion, is the February 24th invasion, is this an inflection point? I mean, is this one of these dates that's going to, remain in energy market history like October 1973 with the oil embargo? Is this one of these pivotal moments that's going to be?
I don't think so.
You don't think so? You think this is a blip in energy history terms?
It's just kind of an event that we are going to mark on a chart. That's it. But let me tell you about PP, because this is kind of fascinating. The story of PP. PP entered Russia and they created a company called TNK PP.
Right.
And the moment they are there, and it was a very successful company, the Putin cronies started attacking the company, and the situation got so bad that the CEO of the company fled Russia.
Right.
In 2008. Who is that CEO? Bob Dudley, the current head of the BP.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. Now, they forced BP basically to cut its shares. They forced it to sell. And then a part of the deal is to become part of Rosneft, where they own 20%.
Right.
But the situation for PP was always bad. In a sense, they really wanted to get out all the time because it was a bad deal and they've been harassed all the time. So now that was a perfect time for it to announce an exit. The second story basically is related to Shell. Shell had all those gas developments and LNG, etc., in Sakhalin. And after they brought in all the technology to Russia and all the expertise, and they are done with everything, they built everything. Once they are done in 2006, Putin cronies came in again, and they forced them to sell 50%. Here is the piece of information that everyone should know. The total investment of all the oil majors in Russia is only a fraction of their own investment in LNG in Australia.
Huh.
Which is so small.
So you're just saying overall the majors' investment in Russia in when you look at it in terms of their overall capex is still very small.
It's very small, which means that even if they leave, what the heck? Who cares?
Gotcha. But your broader point. Well, so let me go back to this. So you think that this is a minor issue in terms of, because it seems to me it should be an inflection point in terms of the U.S. thinking about energy security, compared to what happened to Europe. As I've said many times, Europe overinvested in renewables, underinvested in hydrocarbons. They shut their baseload plants and they relied too much on imports. I mean, this seems to me, obvious, right? But you're saying, I mean, what I hear you saying is that we're making too much of this, or am I misreading what you're saying?
We are making too much of this. Let me finish the story of those companies, because I think once we have the complete picture, we understand what the point I'm trying to make.
Okay.
Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, and now declared that they stopped imports of crude oil from Russia, but Canada does not import any crude from Russia.
Right.
Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of England, said that they are going to stop oil imports from Russia, but he said by the end of 2022. And then he tried to promote the investments in the North Sea that he was trying to convince the House of Commons and the British people to agree to.
Right.
Biden said we are stopping Russian imports. We already know right now, as we speak, we have ships full of oil coming from Russia to the United States. So what he meant, only the new contracts? He said that he imposed sanctions on banks and kicked them out of SWIFT. It turns out they are only small local banks, have no impact. So this is coming from politicians, coming from companies. So why?
And there are still banks that are still one of our previous guests, John Harpel, said that there are the banks that are doing most of the business for paying for Russian gas. They're still in business. They haven't stopped.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. So the idea here is you look at politicians, you look at the companies. Where is the pressure on Russia? Okay. You look at Procter and Gamble, for example, they said, we are not going to make any new investment.
Uh-huh.
You look at McDonald's, oh, we closed our stores. 62,000 Russians lost their jobs, but our closure is only temporary. So why Putin has to yield to any of this pressure? I mean, what the idea here? So you look at all those announcements and you can see how weak the reaction is. If you want to talk about the inflection point, it's on the other side. And I will tell you where the other side is if you want to consider it an inflection point.
Sure.
Putin hit the carbon neutrality policies of Europe really hard,
right,
and delay them by a few years. And that's a major achievement. So if you want to consider that an inflection point, yes, it is, but it's on the other side. And
so just to be clear, you're saying that I'm just going to play this back. So what you're saying is that all of this talk about sanctions and the talk about isolating Russia when it comes to hydrocarbons is not going to be very effective. But what the big result is the change in Europe in terms of their climate goals.
Absolutely. They are going back to coal. They are going back to oil. And here is the other point that people do not pay attention to. Because of the war, we've seen a major increase in fuel prices worldwide, and we've seen major increase in food prices worldwide.
Right.
We've seen demonstrations in several poor countries, and we've seen people complaining in the industrial countries. We've seen governments literally announcing subsidies to the population to lower fuel prices.
Right.
We've seen countries lowering taxes on fuel to help the populations. What the result of that? That means we have lowering taxes means less money, less revenues. At the same time, they are shifting the subsidies from the green energy and from electric vehicles to fuel and food, which means that less money is available for green energy and electric vehicles. So Putin has already done the damage and delayed them by several years anyway. And that's going to increase the demand for oil. That's going to increase the demand for natural gas above all forecasts.
Huh. Well, I want to recall, so this is your second time on the Power Hungry podcast, so I'm glad to have you on. And I remember, I think we spoke in late November or November of 2020, and you were predicting an energy crisis then. And you were saying this is going to happen. And you were talking about underinvestment in hydrocarbons. And it was clear we had this crisis in terms of pricing and massive price increases even before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Well, so play this out for me. Where are we going to be in 6 or 9 months? Do you think that will this price spike then lead to a recession, because recessions are very closely correlated with high oil prices? Where does this go from here?
First of all, let me start with the last point, because I think this is very important. The conventional wisdom we have in the Western world that there is this correlation between high oil prices and recessions. I can really prove to any academic who wrote papers showing that, I can prove to them that they are wrong. There is no theory in economics to explain what the impact of high oil prices on economic growth. There is none. All they did, basically, they have data and they did some econometric analysis, and they come up with those results. The fact is, if you go to the same models, you take oil prices out, you put taxes, you put interest rate, you put government expenditures, you get the same results. We have theories to explain government expenditures, interest rate, and taxes, but we have no theories to explain oil. So the bottom line of all of this is, look at 2008. Oil prices went up from 2004 to 2008 in like 4 or 5 fold, and economic growth continued to go up. How do they explain that? Well, that was the only period in history where we have higher economic growth, higher government expenditures, higher military expenditures, higher expenditures on security because of all that airport things, that all these scanners and all the stuff that they spent worldwide. It was the only period where interest rate was going down and the dollar was going down. That combination never happened in history. So looking forward right now, because you asked me that question, about what's going to happen. Here is the problem. I was predicting a major energy crisis. Now that energy crisis is going to happen earlier and bigger.
How do you mean? How do you mean earlier? What?
Well,
isn't it already here? That's what I'm wondering.
No, this is the coming energy. What we are in right now is nothing relative to the coming one, because in the coming one, you and I will stay home because there will be no gasoline.
Come on now, really?
Okay? Yes. Let me explain. Let me explain what's going to happen. The problem we are talking about here is the following. Now we have a major inflation worldwide. We have demonstrations in several countries. We might end up with turmoil and probably some governments changing in those countries. And if they are oil producing countries, we are even in a bigger trouble because their own production might go offline. That's on one side. The other side is, if we end up with a recession, a global recession, because of everything going on right now, then that investment we were predicting that will come to the oil industry and gas industry is going to be delayed one more time.
So that the recession would act like another COVID in terms of oil, in terms of hydrocarbon investment.
Yes.
So that we would have two then close cycles with underinvestment in hydrocarbon and in the upstream part of the hydrocarbon business.
Absolutely. And on the other side, we have another problem that people are not paying attention to. Now, oil producing countries have the money. It's $100 oil. They made tons of money. And what will those oil producing countries do? First, they've been pushed by the European leaders and the Biden administration to meet climate change goals.
To reduce production.
Correct. To reduce, basically to mitigate the impact of climate change. What that means is they are going to take some of the money that's supposed to go to increase oil production and increase capacity and invest to increase capacity to meet future demand. They are going to take it and invest it somewhere else. At the same time, those countries got burnt really hard in recent years because of low prices, so they want to diversify their economy. So they are going to take this money and spend it somewhere else. Don't expect, for example, in a country like Saudi Arabia, in the past, we've seen all the revenues being spent on major project, on mega project, etc. This is not going to happen again. What we are going to see is, we are going to see some of it, some increase in government expenditures, the others will be saved. So we are not going to see that massive increase on spending in the oil producing countries because of the diversification process. So you have the global push for climate change, and you have the push for economic diversification. Between the two.
But let me interrupt you, because I'm a little confused, because you said that this push for climate effort now has been delayed, right?
That's in Europe. That's in Europe. I'm talking about the oil producing countries.
Right, but if you're saying the OPEC member countries are taking climate change seriously and underinvesting in hydrocarbons?
Yes.
Okay, so let me just play this forward, because I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. So you're predicting then that in 2 years, 3 years, we're going to see even higher oil prices, over 100, or sustained over 100 or 200. Not asking you to name a number, but you're saying that we're going to have sustained cycles of underinvestment in hydrocarbons, in drilling specifically, that is going to lead to longer term higher oil and natural gas prices globally.
It's not only oil and gas, basically. This is throughout the energy sector, because we are not going to have enough money even to invest in renewables and others. I mean, we are going to be really strained on all fronts. And if this issue that we are facing now, higher food prices and higher fuel prices, is going to continue, then governments, especially, I mean, we talk about Europe and the United States, government politicians are worried about elections. They are going to worry about the short cycle. So they are going to do whatever to give subsidies to people to compensate for fuel prices and food prices. And they are not going to worry about the long term when it comes to climate change and everything else. So what I'm saying here is we have to distinguish between the policies of the oil producing countries and the consuming countries, and those pushing those for a long time to work on their global change agendas And those guys are going to take some of the money basically to achieve them, because that's the only way they can reduce the pressure. And if you look at the behavior of Saudi Arabia, for example, they really decided to take the lead on this, as we've seen in recent negotiations. So they are focusing on hydrogen, for example. They are focusing on a green hydrogen. They are focusing on this new city, NEOM. So we are seeing changes in those countries. And the problem is those extra revenues in oil are going to go to subsidize food, to subsidize fuel, and then some extra government spending, and the rest is going to go somewhere else. And therefore, we are going to have another cycle of low investment in upstream.
And because of that low investment, then higher oil and gas prices, high oil and natural gas prices.
And other energy sources, because
Right.
the problem is what we learned from the experience before the invasion of Ukraine, what we learned from what we saw in India and China in particular, and then in Europe, they had energy crises that are self-made.
Right.
And if you look at that energy crisis, we learned something amazing. If you look at it, for example, in England, what happened is wind stops on September 6th, and then the snowball basically start getting larger and larger after that. Immediately, they wanted gas. There is no gas. Gas prices went through the roof. They wanted coal. Coal prices went through the roof. And then that snowball start getting larger and larger. In terms of China and India, they used coal. The coal was not available. And then they resorted to natural gas. So natural gas prices went up. Then LNG prices went through the roof. They returned to oil, and oil was at 75 at that time.
Right.
And oil was the cheapest source of energy. Then they resorted to power outages, to kind of managed power outages. Then Chinese factories, basically, who have orders for the next 2-3 years because of the supply chain problems, they resorted to private generation, which is the same story we talked about, 15 years ago. We wrote about it, you and I, in the Energy Tribune,
Right.
when that was alive at that time. So we return to that cycle again, where we have private generation. Private generation increased the demand for diesel, but no one was counting for it. All of a sudden, it's an extra demand. So that's substitution.
Extra call on oil. But let me ask you about the coal market, because this is one of the things that I think is really interesting. And I've written about the coal business now for, a dozen years or more, talking about why it's been so durable. And it was just in the last couple of days that the Chinese government announced an increase of 300 million tons of new production per year as their new plan, and to quit importing coal, I presumably because of the price spike with Newcastle hitting $400 a ton. So it seems to me that the coal market has been one of these other areas that's had underinvestment. And one of the reasons why is because of ESG, partly because of COVID, the rest of it. But is the IEA is projecting that coal demand will continue rising through the end of next year, through 2023. What do you see in the coal market? And is this just rhyming with the other investment issues that you're talking about? Because Chinese are clearly going to be investing more in coal. How do you see the coal business?
Generally speaking, you don't have to go that far to China. Basically, we have the same problem in the United States when natural gas prices increase substantially and utilities basically switch back to coal.
Right.
But again, we don't have enough investment to meet the demand to switch back all the way. At the same time, look at what Italy and Germany did. Both of them, they went back to coal right now, and we don't have enough investment in that too. So that's why I emphasize the idea of energy crisis rather than just oil and gas. It's really throughout this. Then add to it another problem, because this is really where those who support renewables do not understand the point, or probably they are ignoring it. Two parts. The first part is there is no substitution between renewable energy and oil in Europe, United States, India, and China. There is no substitution, which means that even if they double, triple renewable energy, it has no impact on oil. It impacts nuclear, it impacts coal and natural gas, but no oil. That's number one. Number two,
and just to be clear, that's because the oil used for transportation, that we can produce electricity, but it doesn't affect the liquid fuel market.
Correct.
For heavy duty trucks, light duty vehicles, et cetera.
The percentage of electricity or the percentage of oil from the oil demand used in electricity demand in those countries is less than 2%, and in most of them less than 1%.
Right. Okay.
And mostly because of either historical reasons or geographic reasons, which mean that you cannot even do the replacement.
Right.
In some cities in the United States, by the way, people do not understand the legal impact on this. If you have a building, let's say you are an investor and you own a 4-story building that's 150 years old in one of the Northeast states, and they've been using heating oil, and if you want to switch, you exceed the $10,000 limit that is allowed by the city. Otherwise, you have to make it handicap compliant.
Right. Okay. Right. But your point about the oil, the electricity, we're not using electricity for transportation. So that's your point. That's your point about the renewables not displacing any oil. But you were, I think you got on a tangent there. But what is the second point?
The second point basically is we are coming to a period in the coming years, in the next 7 years, where several mega projects that in wind and solar are going to reach their end of life.
Okay.
And then they need to be replaced. And
so these are the big offshore wind projects? Is that what you're talking about?
No, basically those are mostly onshore because these are old ones before the offshore, basically.
Okay.
But the idea here is now we need government assistance for the growth and for the replacement.
Okay.
Okay, and we don't have that. So they want to ignore this point for some reason. And the other thing is companies are playing a game here because based on the contract, they have to reclaim the land, which means that they have to remove all those wind turbines and bring the land the same way it was before they started this. Okay, so what we are seeing is basically companies creating some kind of subsidiaries, completely independent subsidiaries, and then they go bankrupt in the last day of business. And then the taxpayer get hit cleaning up the mess. So that's why if you look at the whole energy space, we are coming into all these issues at once in the next 7 years.
Well, it's not a cheery picture you're painting.
It's not, but I can tell you, if you are an investor, it's the crazy time for you.
Well, so does that mean? Well, I'm just going to ask you. So does that mean that the super majors are a good investment? I mean, how do you see this playing out? Because you're pointing out the lack of substitutability for oil. I've been thinking about and writing a lot about and talking about a lot the issue of metals and minerals that are going to be needed for alternative energy portfolios. But it sounds to me like you're correct me if I'm wrong, you're long hydrocarbons. You're saying that oil and gas are going to be the things that drive the global economy for decades to come. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. Not only that, let me explain to you something I think the audience will be excited about.
Okay.
If you look at the behavior of companies and governments, the same way we looked at the behavior of companies and governments toward Russia and how they fooled people by their statements, the same thing when it comes to carbon neutrality is exactly the same. What we are seeing is companies, let's say a company that has several assets and one of them is an old refinery, and they sell it to someone else and they say, "Wow, look at my carbon footprint. I cut it by 40%." And the board is really happy because they cut their carbon footprint by 40%. But someone else bought the refinery.
Right.
And the world did not see that. It's not an actual decrease. We are seeing companies claiming the trees on their campuses in their carbon neutrality plan. We've seen companies that cut the office space because of COVID, claiming the lost office space
is an improvement on their CO2 emissions.
On footprint.
So you're just saying a lot of this is just I don't know if kabuki theater is the right word, but it's a lot of pretend then, or this. How do you describe it then?
I describe it in this way. For those who follow my presentations, basically, and in my speeches, I show some slides and I express those behaviors in animal behavior, and one of them basically is the deer. And the deer basically eats the low-hanging fruit. He cannot climb up and eat up. So those who are really active, they will get only the low-hanging fruit, and that's it. Everyone else basically are scavengers. in this case. And scavengers, they are going to go and say, you know what? Look at my last 40 years and see what I've done that was not green, but now we consider it a green. So a company like Walmart can claim all the skylights.
Right.
That's been there for 40 years. They can claim them in their carbon neutrality policy. Walmart has been green for the last 20 years.
Fair enough. So let me jump back to Ukraine for a second. So if I'm just remembering what you were talking about before, so is the net result of this war Russia and China becoming more closely aligned, and then Europe and the US left behind him? How does this play out geopolitically, and where do the Saudis fit into this? Because the Saudis are the biggest exporter in the world, and now their oil has become much more sought after. How do you see the longer term geopolitics playing out?
US LNG market share in Western Europe is now engraved in stone. So that US
LNG in Europe is going to be the key supply, the key supplier for Europe.
Correct. Russia will come back and supply Europe, but the level of dependence basically will be lower.
Okay.
The biggest threat to Russia in the future is not the US, and it's not Europe, it's not China. The biggest threat is Iran.
To Russia, you're talking about?
Yes. And the reason why, because in 2008, there was a proposal where Qatar will build a pipeline from Pars Field in Iran, which means that the pipeline will be filled by Iranian gas.
Yeah.
That goes through Syria to the Arab gas pipeline through Turkey to Europe and compete with the Russian gas in Europe. And that project basically was killed in 2008.
Right.
So if the US is really serious, and Europe, if the US and Europe are really serious about reducing the influence of Russia in Europe, then we can understand why the Biden administration is pushing for a deal with Iran.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because there are two things that I wanted to talk about, because I don't claim to be a geopolitical expert, but I was in Madrid, I think it was in 2008 at the World Petroleum Congress, and I talked to the Iranian delegation, or I saw their presentation, and they were very eager to move their gas into Europe. I mean, this has been a long-term goal of the Iranians, and this is, well, so two questions. Is this the opportunity then, despite Hezbollah, despite the fact that the Iranians and their government have clearly been antagonistic to the United States, is this their big opportunity then to get into the European market?
Absolutely.
And do you think it will happen?
I think if they are able to solve the crisis in Syria and Iraq, because we are still in crisis. I mean, we are talking about the least stable countries in the world right now, Iraq and Syria.
Right.
So we need to solve
both of
issues.
which are in energy crisis, have been for years. The Iraqis
Correct.
are still depending on the Iranians for electricity, for natural gas. I mean, their economy is still in the crapper.
So we need to stabilize those countries, and stabilization of at least a country like Syria probably needs a change in the political leadership. But if that's resolved, then the Iranian gas will reach Europe in no time.
Well, then,
pipeline.
Go ahead.
Building that pipeline is really cheap, and the distance is very small. The Arab gas pipeline is already being built. It's there, and it reached the borders of Turkey. So all we need just the other extension within Turkey to take it to Europe.
And then through Ceyhan and then on to Europe.
Yeah. And since the Qataris are investing in it, and Qataris have a really great relationship with Turkey, then Turkey have no problem as long as they get the toll on it.
Well, so what would the Saudis say about this? Because they're not exactly friends with the Iranians. How do the Saudis see this triangulation?
Basically, it is very clear that they want to end the war in Yemen to their advantage, and that's really the number one thing they want.
So they could put up with the Iranian the thawing of relationships with Iran.
Well, no, not really. I mean, at least they really want to focus on their country. They want to build their country. They want to fulfill the 2030 vision. So they want to end that war to their advantage so they can focus their resources on their country. But at the same time, with Iran, basically, we have to have some new Iran, if that's a correct term,
Yeah.
to be involved in those products.
But is that real? But is that realistic, Anas? I mean, the government there has been intractable for a long time, and I'm not claiming some special knowledge here, but having been in Lebanon, the Iranians use the Hezbollah for a proxy state in Lebanon as a leverage against the Israelis. And I mean, would the Israelis allow this to happen? The Iranians to get gas into Europe?
Let's look at it from another. Yes, if we want to do 1 + 1 = 2. You are absolutely correct. But no one was expecting the Shah to be kicked out of Iran.
Okay.
No one expected Hosni Mubarak to be forced out. No one expected Muammar al-Qaddafi to be forced out.
Who was the last guy? I didn't know
Muammar Gaddafi was the leader.
Oh, Muammar Gaddafi. I'm sorry, yes, in Libya. Okay, yes, forgive me. Yeah, okay.
So no one was expecting that. So based on 1 + 1 = 2, no one was expecting that at all, but it happened. Okay. So I am not surprised if it happens because it fits with that history. The problem is, do we know the timing? No. Can we do 1 + 1 = 2 and know something? No.
Okay. So let me ask you about
to show it.
Sure. So let me ask you about a different pipeline. So as I think about the Biden administration, what they're doing, and a lot of it just seems to defy any kind of explanation in terms of energy security or long-term strategy or anything else, excuse me, is why would they not support the Transmed pipeline? I mean, this was the Israelis were in favor of it, bringing Israeli gas, and Chevron bought Noble, which Noble had a big stake in the Leviathan and Tamar fields in offshore Israel. Those are incredibly valuable, enormous gas resources that could have gone, that the proposal was with the Transmed pipeline to remove that gas from Israel into Southern Europe. Why would the Biden administration not support that?
Well, it's really not about the Biden administration. I mean, there is a lot of propaganda involved in this. The gas is extremely expensive.
The offshore gas in Israel is expensive.
And the only way they were able to get deals because they were political deals. They were not able to get commercial deals. Their deal with Jordan is political. Their deal with Egypt is political. But no one for 15 years were waiting for a deal. No commercial deals.
So the Israelis could afford to use the gas internally, but it wasn't priced well enough for export. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. So these are
well, give me an idea on the price. I haven't heard that before. That's just news to me. I mean, I didn't know.
Just because right now, given the spot prices, everything is profitable. But if we go back before the crisis, if you go back to the winter time or earlier than that, the gas in that area basically is very expensive. The Russian gas, the Egyptian gas is way cheaper because the amount is way larger. So when you divide it by you get a lower average cost. But the Israeli gas is very expensive, and all the deals they made was political deals. That's the only way to market it. The other one, there is kind of an issue that one of the main problems we are facing with this Transmed is the topography of the land, the geology of the land to build it is against it.
The subsea.
Yes.
Okay.
So we have a serious problem even in terms of technology and other issues, etc. So this is okay on paper, looks good, but nothing else. But if you really want to be serious about a pipeline going to Europe, we really need a change in Algeria toward better investment laws that allows foreign companies to come in and bring in more gas. There is a lot of gas in Algeria. And then you want to bring the Nigerian gas through the pipeline to Algeria to take it to Europe. I think that's really one of the best solutions in front of Europe right now. It's Algeria and Nigeria through Algeria.
So African gas into Europe then.
Absolutely.
African gas, which might be easier than Iranian gas, at least in terms of politics in the near term, but that the triangulation against Russia would be African and Iranian gas as opposed to Russian gas, combined with U.S. gas. So let me ask you something. We talked the other day on the phone when you graciously allowed to come on the podcast again. Let's talk about Britain for a minute, and then we'll end up here pretty soon because we've already been talking about an hour. I asked you about the UK, and I've had several guests from British guests on the podcast lately about talking about if the UK was to change course now and repeal their idiotic fracking ban and start drilling. I'll ask you the question. If they started and they wanted to do shale gas in the UK, how soon would it be able to come on stream in any kind of significant quantities?
I don't think they'll repeal that. I don't think they'll produce gas from shale at all. This is a done deal. It's over. I think they are going to invest in the North Sea. There will be major investments made in the North Sea that will bring a lot of gas. It will bring a lot of oil. And I think that's where the focus is going to be. It's not going to be shale.
So why not? Why not onshore? Just too many logistical hurdles with pipes and water and sand and frac crews and drilling rigs. It's too hard of a lift in terms of the actual stuff of the business.
Okay. You take that right now, whatever you described, and you show it to the environmentalists, and you lose the election.
Okay? I see. So
you want something out of sight, far away from you. We learned it from Nigeria. We learned it from other countries. Right? I mean, you wrote about wind power in the ocean and sea and all this stuff. Why? Because they want to keep it away from everyone who's complaining about it.
And doing that offshore solves that problem.
Correct. So that's one. But
that's
still,
a good point. Yeah.
The cost here is very high anyway. They don't have the capabilities that we have in the United States, because one of the main problems that all countries have, because as you know, shale exists in like probably about 15 countries in large quantities. Yeah. But even in Algeria, in a country like Algeria, where we have massive amount of shale in this country, what is the problem? We don't have infrastructure.
Right.
In the United States, the Permian has been there for 100 years.
Right. Okay.
The infrastructure is there, and the knowledge, the human resources, the universities, the training, that does not exist anywhere else.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good point. And it's I've been asking people in the oil and gas industry about this, posing that question. Well, how long would it take? Because you're going to need a latest model AC top drive rig. You need roustabouts, roughnecks, tool pushers. You need all that technical expertise. Those are going to have to come from Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Pennsylvania. Those crews have to come from somewhere. And already they're in high demand here in the U.S. And I hear over and over they don't have enough people here. So to train up those technicians, those technologists, those roustabouts will take time. And then you've got to move the rigs over there. And then they still don't have the sand. They don't have the pipelines. They don't have the other infrastructure, truck drivers, all the other stuff that the Permian has in spades that, as you point out, has been developed over decades. But that's a good point. It seems to ring true to me to think that much easier to try and do it offshore where they can do that investment and where they already have a lot of installed infrastructure, right? With the
offshore, basically, a single well could get you 25,000 to 50,000 barrels a day if they really hit the jackpot,
right?
Which is the equivalent of a large number of shale wells.
Sure. So we haven't mentioned the word nuclear, and I know you from what I've seen, you don't necessarily, it's not where you spend a lot of your time. But does this signal a potential opening then for nuclear over with vis-a-vis renewables?
I think we already started. We already started with the nuclear. We are seeing several countries developing that. I think we have a change of heart toward nuclear in many places, and now we are seeing poorer countries looking at it. We've seen Middle Eastern countries looking at it. We already seen the UAE starting one. Saudi Arabia is building one.
The Saudis are building a reactor.
Well, they haven't started yet, but they already have the legal framework to start.
And Abu Dhabi started the first reactor at Al Baraka, and the Korean reactor there. Yeah,
correct. Egypt has already started, but now because of the war, because it's a Russian reactor, so we don't know what the future of this reactor is going to be in light of the crisis in Ukraine. But they already started building Al Daba nuclear reactor. But other countries basically needs it if you look at future energy demand, specifically Algeria and Morocco. Morocco in particular, I mean, despite all this push for renewable energy and all this push to find natural gas, Morocco needs nuclear power. They have no other choice. If you look at the population growth, you look at the economy after 2035, this country is going to be, the population is going to boom, and it's just going to be a very large country with major consumption, but no resources.
Right.
So those countries need the nuclear no matter what. Any way you look at it, they need it.
So I guess you could say that about pretty much all of Africa, couldn't you?
Yes, but we have to distinguish between the countries with smaller populations and the larger populations, and the age structure. Right. You need to look at the age structure.
The demographic growth, yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Well, so Anas, and my guest again is my friend, Dr. Anas Alhajji. He's the editor of Attaqa, which is the only Arabic language media outlet focused on the energy business. He is the editorial advisor there. I meant to say. So I've thought about you starting this new media outlet. How hard is it? We've talked a long time, and I know you have family in the Mideast, and your wife Gufran has family in the Middle East. Has it gotten easier over the last few years to because I see you straddling the Arabic world and the kind of American world? Is it easier? Does it get harder? I mean, because now you're not straddling time zones, you're straddling languages, cultures. Has it gotten easier for you in terms of your business, or is it you just used to it now? Tell me about that.
Okay. Well, people should know I live here in Texas, so
right.
They need to know
in the
that.
Dallas area, yeah.
Correct. Well, given the type of business I do, I remember since we've been talking since year 2000, I think. Yeah. When I was in Ohio. Yeah. The nature of my business, basically, from day one, was related to the rest of the world. So it's become kind of a norm. To get up at 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the morning to catch up with everything else, et cetera, et cetera. So for me, it became just a part of the habit, part of life, et cetera. I don't think my kids will like it or live it the way I'm doing it right now. But it is very tough. But I am really amazed at one thing that just kind of, I mean, people do not pay attention to this. People go to Twitter, and a lot of people are on Twitter. Okay, Twitter has a translation button, and whenever you see something in a foreign language that kind of attracts your attention, press that translate button, because there are a lot of valuable information and sometimes breaking news that even the Wall Street Journal and others will not report until the second day. You get it from those languages. So for us, one of the most impressive things is the number of non-Arabic speakers who are following Attaqa is in thousands.
Really? Huh.
Yes.
Interesting.
So this idea of advanced technology to do the translation on the spot enabled us to communicate through languages on the spot in an unbelievable way.
Huh. That's interesting. Well, I just noticed that today, in fact, because I was looking at your Twitter feed and sort of click here, and I was like, well, dummy, why didn't I see this before? But
right.
But, okay, well, so that's great. So Anas, I like to ask my guests, so what are you reading? I know you're busy all the time with, looking at what's going on. Are you reading for pleasure at all? What, any books on your...
Well, I am going to the basics, basically, and I am reading a couple of books because I think this is going to be very important for us when we talk about the future of the fossil fuel. I'm reading a couple of books on
asphalt and politics. Okay.
And this is one of them. I think there is another one somewhere. But the idea here is a lot of people do not pay attention to the fact that those electric vehicles are extremely heavy.
Right.
And that's why President Biden cannot have an electric vehicle. And the reason why, because these are armored vehicles, so they are already very heavy.
Right.
And if you make them electric, then they are going to be extremely heavy and they cannot maneuver or drive fast. So it has to be like a special tank almost to do that. But one of the problems we have with electric vehicles and electric trucks, because of their heavy weight, the tear on the tires and the tear of the roads is way higher than before. Right. And therefore, tires come from what? From oil and gas.
Right.
That's been ignored in the analysis. and roads, asphalt, comes from oil and gas. And that's been ignored in the analysis too. So I'm trying to understand the asphalt and the asphalt politics, and trying to kind of, again, it's a basic issue, but still kind of exciting.
Well, that's interesting, and that of course comes from the heaviest end of the barrel, right? Which would be in the single digits in the API rating, right? In terms of the gasoline is in the 50s or 60s in terms of that, something like that.
Canada and Venezuela
are the heavy oil producers, right? So last question then, Anas, what gives you hope?
Basically, I think markets will always overrun politics in the long run. And I think that's where politicians get hit really hard. Markets make people sin.
Markets, say that again. Markets make people sin.
Yes. And that's the power of markets, which means that even believers sin because of markets. Whether you talk about various sins, whether you talk about riba or interest rates or other things that are forbidden in the original text, but people sin because there is an incentive there.
Right.
So if people sin because of markets are so powerful that make they override politics in the long run. So that's where what gives me hope, that all this pasturing of politicians basically is dead in the long run.
Well, we'll end there then. It's always fun to talk on us. Like your interesting takes on what's happening. I've been, like you, I'm sure, just been watching this Russia-Ukraine business in dismay at the needless death and destruction. But I hope it will end soon. But I sure appreciate you coming on.
Thank you. Let me tell you just one piece of information that people should know.
Okay.
Oil was discovered in Baku before the United States, probably by about 10, 15 years. And that city in Baku, basically, it was under the control of Russia. It changed the world and changed the politics and still shaped the politics of the world until today. And that's where Stalin went in, rallied the workers, and brought in the communist revolution.
In Baku.
It came from the oil industry, yes.
Yeah, well, I don't know if recalling Stalin at this point is such a cheery message, but we'll leave it there.
Well, the idea is they still influence the market since like 1870. That's what the idea is.
Fair enough. Okay. Well, listen, again, my guest has been Anas Alhajji. He's the editorial advisor at Attaqa, which is the only Arabic language media outlet focused solely on the energy sector. Anas, many thanks for being on the Power Hungry podcast.
Thank you.
And to all of you in podcast land, tune in for the next episode of the Power Hungry podcast. Until then, see ya.